Ben, I want to start with you. Let's talk a little bit about boundaries of science fiction. Whether you want to talk about definitions or indicia, talk about the genre itself in terms of how you think about science fiction.
Yeah, so first thing to say about whenever you're trying to define a genre is any reader of genre will attest it's a very blurry field. So science fiction bleeds into fantasy, bleeds into horror, bleeds into other things, of course. Neuromancers come up a lot today, and obviously you could read that as a hard-boiled detective fiction if you choose. So the boundaries are blurry, but one thing that's been productive for me over the last couple of months thinking about it is the way that the genres of the fantastic, namely horror, fantasy, and science fiction, can be differentiated along the lines of morality, where science fiction is often about a world in which technological or social progress outstrips our moral compass, our ability to deal with it. So things happen fast enough where the old rules no longer apply, and we're trying to catch up and develop new rules for thinking about whatever new technology or alien species suddenly comes into the world. Fantasy is about a stable morality. The good versus evil remains the same. Frodo and Gandalf know Sauron is evil, and there's never any question that maybe he's just misunderstood or something like that. It's absolutely the case, but social progress or technological progress has done a 180, and the past in The Lord of the Rings, for example, is actually more advanced than the present, right? There was more magic in the past, society did greater things, engineering feats, what have you. And horror is about the recognition that right now our knowledge and our morality are so intertwined that we cannot come to grips with something radically new entering into the sphere of our knowledge. So, oh my God, there are werewolves. Science doesn't allow for that, right? But there they are, and the kind of the juxtaposition of incompatible facts. I know this, and yet this is. So again, science fiction really about the future, but a future in which present morality can't handle the new thing, whatever that new thing happens to be.
Let me throw this out as a jump ball to any of the panelists. So there was a definition, Ben, that you directed me by Darko Suvin, who observed that science fiction is, quote, the literature of cognitive estrangement. The literature of cognitive estrangement. Christine, Will, is that what you see yourselves doing? And Brad, I'll invite you to jump in on this too. How do you envision the boundaries or the indicia of what you consider to be science fiction? Christine?
Well, we talked quite a bit earlier about Star Trek, and a lot of us were Trekkie fans. And one of the phenomenal things about the first generation Star Trek is every one of those episodes, and there were like a couple dozen, were rooted in some sociological or political thing that was happening in the world at the time. But it put the story in a sci-fi environment, and it allowed you to see it as an outsider looking in. And sci-fi is such a huge range of genres, but some of the sci-fi that I find most appealing is science fiction that lets you look at human beings and our society through the lens of another society so that we become the aliens. And in the book that I have written and have yet to publish, it is really written today about us, but looking through the lens of a society in which we are actually not classified as human, we're subhuman because of all of our deformities and our deficiencies.
For me, I feel like I have a pretty broad definition of science fiction. I mean, so I wasn't familiar with Darko's definition before this. I read up a little bit. He was somewhat disparaging about science fiction that was just merely about the culture that we have today plus technology. But the reality is that technology always defines what our social structure is like. It changes us. I think it's all interesting. It's all a valid reflection of what we're doing today. I mean, that's all it can ever be, is a reflection of the society we have and where we're going and what our shortcomings are. And I think that's really what science fiction is about.
I don't know that I understand the definition. I thought about it some after you said it. I find the dystopian future just as interesting as the optimistic future. I find the stuff in science fiction that is unimaginable just as interesting as the stuff that feels very imaginable. The best way to get some of this, and maybe it is cognitive dissonance of sorts, is to read a bunch, like I described reading William Burroughs from beginning to end. Read Philip K. Dick from beginning to end. He wrote about 50 or 60 books. I've read about 30 of them before I ran out of gas. I have all of them on a shelf. And as I read them, I put them at the big, like I would pull them and actually I went right to left. I don't know why I did them Hebrew order. And I kept coming across things that he got exactly right. Right, this is the 1960s and 1970s writing about 2000 to 2020. Some things he got just totally right, and some things he got totally wrong. And some things that he got totally wrong that continue to inspire not just science fiction, but also drama, other genres. And I'll give you an example. In Philip K. Dick's world, you can get from the US to Europe in 5 minutes. There's a vehicle that gets you from US to Europe in 5 minutes. And it's throughout his books. Like this notion that, geographic travel by plane is constrained is not a constraint in his world. He believes we will have solved that. Of course, we haven't. An example of what he got entirely wrong was that we store everything on these gigantic metal machines buried under the ground. Wait a second. Right? We kind of do, don't we? Especially if you have bitcoins. But he called it ox tape, and he, like constraints around it didn't quite work. How many of you are 24 fans? How many of you believe you can get anywhere in LA during a commercial? From one place to another during a commercial. That's Jack Bauer. He can do that. And I continue. My wife gets very annoyed when I pretend I can get from Boulder to Denver during a commercial. That sort of stuff rolls through lots of different things. But I think it's imagined, like this notion that you can sort of teleport yourself. It's Star Trek to Philip K. Dick to 24. And how many of you would like to be able to teleport yourself? Wouldn't that save a lot of hassle? Right? So I have a hard time disconnecting them, I guess, between the different genres, and that's why it confused me.
One of the things I feel like is that science fiction has, in some ways, a lower bar for what it needs to achieve compared to something else. If you have a nonfiction book, the expectation is that every word in there contributes toward the end knowledge that you get out of it. Whereas if you read a science fiction book and you get one amazing idea out of it, to me that's enough. That was still a worthwhile book to read. There's some book I read as a teenager that was about these dogs that were only intelligent when they were together in like a pack of like 5 dogs.
I know that book.
You know that book, okay. And like,
Not a great book, but that's the thing I remember too.
Yeah, exactly. I know nothing else about the book. It's not important, but that sort of concept of what would it mean for intelligence to do that? What does it mean to augment intelligence as you come together to be separate from it? I mean, that reflects on human condition and what it means for us to be in a tribe and be out of a tribe and all those kinds of things. And that's great. I got that out of it. I was entertained and I got that idea out of it. And yeah.
Ben, do you read it the same way in terms of a different standard that science fiction puts a very high value on the idea itself, and that allows a certain license with language and to tell stories in a way that isn't quite as critical as other genres?
I think that is in fact the case. I don't think it's fairly the case. I think in the sense that there's a kind of artificial divide between realist fiction and science fiction in a lot of ways. Like they do a lot of the same work. Realist fiction's not real. Science fiction's not real. I mean, it's all fiction. Yeah, I mean, I think it was as a science fiction writer, A.E. Van Vogt, who says something like you need to have a new idea every 4 pages or something like that. And Philip K. Dick often kind of like just hyperbolizes that. Like every page is like, oh, there's a new kind of bomb and there's a new kind of airplane. You can't even keep track of them because of the the prodigious amount of drugs he did.
From book to book, you have.
Yeah, it's amazing. And then China Miéville says, he says genre writers aren't interested in story or in characters. They're interested in monsters and technologies. And so there is, it is a kind of reversal of a kind of social realism, like a Dickens or something like that, where it's about who is this character really, and the deep psychological, feelings of this person with regard to society or another person. And science fiction kind of just reverses and puts the society or the new thing on top and worries less about that depth psychology or human relationships. It can be both, but I think it's just a reversal of the what's primary in the text.
You know what you made me think of? It's very interesting. It's in entrepreneurship, so I'll tie the notion of entrepreneurship back in. It's the same dichotomy that you run into between people working on mobile applications for social sharing and people trying to companies trying to send people to the moon. Like tiny little insignificant problems and really huge problems. And there's this sort of human, I almost use the word arrogance, I don't know if the word arrogance is right, but this human mapping to, well, those are really hard problems and those are really trivial problems, and we should have more of our smart people working on the really hard problems and not on the really trivial problems. And yet, that split in the context of entrepreneurship is completely arbitrary and irrelevant. Some of the most interesting societal changes have come from things like Facebook and Twitter, which when they started out were stupid little apps that you couldn't have said when they started out that they were actually going to have dramatic impact on how society worked. And so this sort of knee-jerk categorization of it, knee-jerk not in, sorry, knee-jerk's wrong, the effort to create a characterization of this is good or this is bad. Interestingly, having read lots and lots of stuff, including plenty of fiction, because my wife Amy feeds me with fiction all the time to try to dull my craziness. I've read an enormous amount of awesome fiction and an enormous amount of shitty fiction. And I've read the same with science fiction. And I've read the same, I can tell you that not every word in my books counts. There's an awful lot of it when you get to the point you're like, I've written this couple of sections, this is good enough, like whatever. Jason won't like it, but screw it. You just give up, right? So I think that you get to that, and we were even talking about this in your first book. William's working on his first book again to make the first book better, because you've learned a lot as a writer through the other books that can go back to the first book. So I think there's an interesting friction point here, which is that you can really master a craft. And I'm not sure the craft categorization is different than if you flip on its side and talk about mastery. Right? And same thing with entrepreneurs, right? You can really get mastery on the technical side, mastery on the business side, and you can try something new after you've got mastery and be a complete failure at it. So, you could, how many times does somebody write their 7th book is a piece of crap? Because they tried something new, and they tried something they weren't that good at, and it didn't quite resonate.
Let's stay with this intersection of entrepreneurship and science fiction and pick up on a thread that William and Brad teed up, and that is the need for internal coherence. That you can change one thing, I think was your language, and I was fascinated at the debates around what could happen in Battlestar Galactica, right? There are rules, logical rules that need to be followed, boundaries. And I'm wondering, in terms of how you guys think about that, especially as it intersects with entrepreneurial experiences, maybe I'll start with Will and Christine to invite you. Do you, first of all, agree that there's one or two things that we could change about the world, and then after that there's logical boundaries? And then let's talk about how that relates to entrepreneurship. Will, you want to go first?
As an entrepreneur, that there's one or two things we can change? Or
as a sci-fi writer.
Oh, as a sci-fi writer. Yeah, I think so. I mean, as just a general writer, suppose I could do anything. It's what I'm interested in is changing one or two things. Otherwise, I'm just off writing fantasy where the rules are made up as they go, and I don't really want to do that. It feels different to me.
Christine?
So I've written several technical books and published them, and that's a completely different process. The process that I used in sci-fi was very similar to what you described. I had a general idea, and then stuff has to start fitting into that or not. And if you change one thing in the future, you might have to go back in the past, because the thing when you're a writer is you are God, and you have complete control over all dimensions inclusive of time up until the point that you publish, at which point time becomes uncontrollable looking backwards. Yeah. And this is really interesting for me, and one reason why I haven't yet tried to even publish, because as I write book 2, I can go back and make book 1 more coherent. So it's nice to be able to control time and space. When you are in the real world, in a business or whatever, you cannot go back in time, and that's the single biggest constraint.
I was building an igloo with my kids when we had a snowfall in Portland recently. And we didn't have quite enough snow to build the top, so we were going to put this piece of wood on. And I said to my son, I'm not sure if the igloo will support the weight of this piece of wood. And he said, you know, it's really too bad we can't save game. Because it is in grains, right? So he pictures this world in which we can save.
Yep.
And if we don't like what happens, restore.
Yeah, exactly.
Brad, how about from your perspective? So companies that come to you with something that's truly disruptive, and not a marginal idea, but something that's disruptive. Do you evaluate that company in the same way that you think about science fiction, that, okay, if I'll go with you about this one assumption, and then what does the world look like?
No. And one more book recommendation besides Williams' books. Remember, you're supposed to buy Williams' books when this is over. Ready Player One is what you made me think of. I don't know if people have read Ready Player One, but it's another example. I can't remember the name of the author.
Ernest Cline.
Yeah.
It's another good near-term science fiction book that has, the metaphor in that book is save game, right? That's the thing. Like, if you remember nothing else from Ready Player One, it's that you can save game. No, I don't play if I could just make this assumption and sort of hold this fixed, and this is the thing this is the thing that's changed. Here's what the future will look like, because it's too dynamic. It changes too much. Especially at the very early stages of a company, getting a company going is the most effective way is to run a bunch of tests against hypotheses. Have your null hypothesis, run the test very aggressively. Either confirm or fail. If you fail, modify, run another test. If you confirm, do more of that. And I think that very few entrepreneurs are really, really rigorous about that, but that's a lot of what's going on. And the mistakes are made when you don't have enough hypotheses that are narrow enough in time, so that, because you can't save game, if a year goes by and your hypothesis is wrong, you wasted a year. If a day goes by and your hypothesis is wrong, you adjust.
Fail fast.
That's right.
Fail
And
fast.
the magnitude of the hypothesis changes over time, right? The implication of those decisions as the company gets bigger and there's more people and there's more interconnected parts changes. So I think it's really, really hard to identify and evaluate a company from an investor perspective, or frankly from an entrepreneur perspective. Should I be spending time on this? Should I join this company? Should I work on this? In that same construct of there's a fundamental assumption I'm making about this whole thing, and it's either going to survive or fail based on how that plays out.
Follow up on that. Does the hypothesis that's getting tested in the entrepreneurial environment strike you as similar to the assumptions that a sci-fi writer will make about we have to change the world? Are those similar?
I think that one is an assertion and one is an assumption. I think the entrepreneur makes an assertion and the sci-fi writer assumption or constraint, right? They're very different. Like, you're God, right? You get to decide this is how this works, and this is how it works, and that's how it works. And if you're an entrepreneur, you can assert this is how it's going to work, and you might or might not be right. If you build your entire structure around that assertion and you're wrong, you're wrong. So can you iterate through that? So I think it's the difference between assumption and assertion.
Christine, you want to jump in?
Well, what your question made me think about is I sort of feel like my whole professional career has been firmly at the intersection of entrepreneurialism and science fiction. And the thing that I think is very similar between the two is, and we talked about this earlier, in both cases, your job is to create a compelling future and paint that in such a vivid way that other people want to join you. And that can be join you in your books. Like I was saying to Will at the break, it was so amazing to hear some of you asking him about characters in his world because you were in that world. It was real for you. And when you're in business, you have to do the same. And you're constantly competing for talent, people to come along and help you make it real. And you're constantly competing for customers, people who believe in your vision. And that is, you need the same skills and competencies, whether you are writing any kind of fiction, particularly science fiction, or you're in business, in order to make that world come true.
You know, and very often, for me at least, inside HP, it's all of the user experience folks that seem to do such an amazing job of turning things into narratives and stories and playing out what would it look like if this piece of technology was in our customer's life, and building up the character of this is our customer.
So actually, super powerful insight. I get asked all the time, especially in companies that are starting to grow, that we're investors in, the difference between UX and UI. And I think many people, until a year ago, maybe 2 years ago, people conflated the two, and they really didn't do a good job of separating them. And in the last couple of years, there's been enough good stuff written about and talked about on the web and others about the difference. And that is the difference at its core. A UI person is concerned about how it looks. A UX person is concerned about how the persona is going to use it. And how it looks is a piece of that, but it's really the way it is used.
You know, the new, for any of you that are developers and you use Agile, almost everybody, at least in Silicon Valley right now, starts all development with storytelling. So you take every possible feature that might be going into your roadmap, and the very first thing you do now is you write the narrative, you write the actual story inclusive of the persona of how this feature is going to be consumed and used by, it could be the machine, it could be the user on the other end, whoever that is, but everything now begins with storytelling.
One of the things I actually thought a couple of years ago as I started to work more deeply with the UX folks at HP was, we're going to have a point where all the new startups that come out are going to be founded by UX people. And I'm a little bit surprised that we haven't seen that. Why haven't we seen that?
Well, I think what's happening is the definition of UX person is shifting. So there was and I encountered this almost a decade ago now. So I've been sort of wallowing around in this for a while. I was an early investor in a company here called Rally Software that pioneered Agile as a toolkit, and has built a very large company around enabling companies to use Agile and Agile development as part of what they do. And very early on, the notion of UX was part of their definition of the software development lifecycle and what it looked like. And what happened was the actual coding, the technical piece of it, started to become integrated into a set of cross-functional activities, but within a team. So instead of having your UX person over there and your devs here and your tests there, Agile shoves all those people together on a 6 to 8 person team and says your UX person is on the same team as a couple of developers, and if you have a test person, they're on that team, and there's a product owner, and that product owner looks like a product person, has UX skill set, and all of a sudden that product owner became the key position. And in different companies, it means different things, right? You're friends with Rick Clow at Google. Rick was a PM in a couple of different places at Google after he was part of FeedBurner, which got bought by Google. I mean, Rick's a PM. He synthesized a lot of those functions. Could Rick code? No, he wasn't a developer, but he synthesized those other functions. What you're finding is that technical founders are either partnering up with somebody that synthesizes those functions, and in fact, through Techstars, we try to get that marriage. We talk about having founders who are product focused, but they don't have to code. So it's looking at the product as a co-founder without necessarily having to be the coder, and you want a dominant group of those on your team. So it's an interesting evolution, and I think the phrase UX is kind of one of those that should probably go away, because that construct of how you think about building products should be driven from that frame of reference. And it's a difference not just on the technical product, but taking an Apple product out of the box and taking a Cisco product out of the box. Right, or an HP product out of the box. Take an HP product out of the box, kind of a crappy experience. The user experience is crappy. I don't care what HP product it is.
No comment.
Yeah, you're not going to comment, okay. But you take an Apple product, no matter what product, and it's a much more satisfying experience. Whether it's a screen, it could just be a big monitor. You know, it's how the protective covering comes off. The different
The
experience.
vacuum as you pull it out of the box.
Yeah, and you might say, well, you know, is that not worth a premium price? It doesn't matter, right? Like, there's no reason why you can't be excellent at that whole cycle.
I want to go back to something that Christine said, which is, as a writer, you are God until it's published, at least, and talk about how that relates to the process of creation in terms of what the writer does individually versus what you borrow from. And Ben, I'll tee up for this first in terms of, you said something we met earlier on this, that the writer could never come up with the work without the genre, but the genre is never quite the same after the writer gets done with it. Can you elaborate a little bit on that?
Yeah, that's a kind of common thing to say in genre criticism, that you know, no work is ever purely generic, right? You know, you say, oh, that's just generic science fiction. Well, it's not exactly the same as any other work, but it's close enough. You know, the edge of the genre is always very blurry, as I said earlier. So the best generic works are those that start from the genre, but then kind of push out a little bit, right, and create a little dimple on the outside of the genre, I think, or, you know, or get resituated into the genre later after, you know, a distance of a few years, when you can look back, oh, I see, science fiction was moving and I wasn't quite ready for it to move as a reader or as a critic, but now I recognize steampunk when it became a thing in the late 80s with Stirling and Gibson's difference engine. I don't think anyone expected you know, Cherry Priest and Felix Gilman and the people who were working in that genre to come along and kind of redefine science fiction as something that could have happened in the past rather than in the future. And we get Neil Stephenson and we get people pushing further and further into the past to kind of think of what if the past were different and what would the present perhaps be like. And I think that idea that, you know, you're pushing on the edges of genre sounds a lot like the kinds of questions we're asking about entrepreneurship. But what's tricky, it seems, is, you know, maybe you're a god when you're a writer, but you also want, I expect you want your thing to go out there in the world and do its own thing, right? I don't think Gibson expected cyberspace to be what we all remember from Neuromancer, but one of the things I remember from Neuromancer is his line that technology requires outlaw zones and that tech finds its use on the streets. At Facebook, according to the social network, right, you know, Mark Zuckerberg programmed in the relationship status, and that made it work for college students. But if that's all it ever did, would it be the thing that it is now? It kind of required the community to decide, how are we going to use this thing? Twitter, likewise, these things, you know, they find their uses out there in the world, and so you kind of have to let them go and hope that they work and that they find their own way of doing things. And I think genre works the same way. You know, if you're too committed to your vision of this is science fiction, we'd still be reading space opera along the lines of Star Trek, and that would be it. We never would have had cyberpunk. We wouldn't have had the new wave. We wouldn't have steampunk. We wouldn't have the new weird and all the kind of slipstream and whatever's going on right now.
I think that's so right on the money. And it's also what an entrepreneur struggles with. Until you release your product, you get to be God. And then once you release your product, you are a judged God. Right? You basically go from being God to being judged. You write your book, you go from being God, you control all the pieces of it, to being judged. Now, you can decide you don't care whether you're judged or not. Right? And in the context of a company, most companies that decide not to be judged by their users are not particularly successful companies. But the dynamic of what happens and the concepts, where the concepts go, you are no longer God controlling them. And that feedback loop is really powerful, because that feedback loop's also not in isolation, I think, in science fiction, as you described, or in entrepreneurship. Right? Things build on each other. Like, you know, something like Snapchat appears because there's a deficiency in the way that people are using Facebook, or WhatsApp, which, you know, just got bought for a ridiculous amount of money, appears because nobody, some others, but they did a better job than anybody else of basically routing around the traditional mobile SMS business and turning that into an internet-based thing that looked like the traditional mobile SMS business. You can't control that stuff, right? You can't predict it. It sort of happens, and all of a sudden when it happens, you have to figure out what to do with it. And the cliche of putting the genie back in the bottle never applies, right? Once it's out, it's out. Like, tomorrow is going to be different because we did this thing today, and now we have to live with it.
And the best, I'm sorry.
Well, one of the things I'm really fascinated by, both in business and in literature, is the intersection of disciplines. And I think we, from starting in college and the way the universities run, we get too siloed. We get too siloed in our disciplines. We get too siloed in our reading patterns. We're too siloed in the way we put teams together. And magic happens when very, very different people and ideas that really have nothing to do with each other come clashing together and create something completely new. And I see that in two ways for our topic here. In writing, I put the first 20 chapters of my book on a website that I created a year and a half ago because I wanted to get some early feedback. And the very first page of that, it's down now because now I'm ready to do something else with it, but the very first page was a bibliography, because the book is really not my idea. All it is a compilation of ideas from about a half a dozen different completely separate genres, from quantum physics to deep history and philosophy and religion and life after death, and all these very, very different things that come together and create something new. But if you map that into business, some of the most extraordinary ideas in business come together when you get groups from not only completely different departments, which are essential and very rarely get done inside an organization, but you also get people and ideas from completely different industries coming together to form new solutions to existing problems. And somehow we are just on the cusp of beginning to make that happen. And if that, that would also be its own asymptote curve that, once that kind of thing begins, I think we'll see entrepreneurialism and invention that is completely different from anything we've seen in the past.
Last question, then we'll open up. There's a tendency anytime you have a juxtaposition and you're thinking about how these things go together to take it too far. So let's ask the reverse question. Where could this go wrong in terms of thinking about science fiction and entrepreneurship? Where do you just think it would either be dangerous to try to, for one to borrow from the other, or where they just don't have anything to do with each other?
I think that humans understand stories. I mean, I really, whether that is an, innate, hardwired fact of humanity, as some of my colleagues believe. I don't believe that, but whether that's the case or we're simply socialized to understand stories, humans do understand stories. But I think it's always a danger when one tells a story that's extrapolated into the future and fails to recognize that it's only a story, right? The way that stories smooth over facts, the way that stories smooth over discontinuities. Earlier at lunch, I just mentioned, that all these stories about rapid change in science fiction tend to smooth over the idea that shouldn't the human subject who experiences those things undergo a radical transformation, not just in now I have an implant, but you should have a different morality you should have an entire different way of seeing the world once you have an implant, your brain, Google Glass in your head or something like that. And the story smooths that over because the same human subject who begins the story is there at the end. And we don't recognize sometimes that there's probably something more traumatic will happen as a result. So I think that it sounds like entrepreneurs need their stories too, and it's a very powerful way to start a process or to get somebody else on board with the process. But I think, I would guess that you need the freedom to kind of modify your story as it goes, or recognize that it's not a train track that you're on. It's there's exits on this highway that lead to other highways.
One of the differences that I think is that the goal of the writer is at each choice point to maximize tension and risk for the characters, whereas the goal of business is generally to minimize tension and risk at each choice point, or at least to maximize success, which usually correlates with minimizing some kind of risk. So they go in very different directions. But at the same point in time, when you read science fiction, I have a particular interest in artificial intelligence. So yeah, in my books, the artificial intelligence is almost always out to sort of rule the world. But does that mean just because it's science fiction that it won't actually happen. It becomes hard to know, right? And so you start to reject out of hand some of the concerns of science fiction just because you know it's a fiction and you know it's a story. But it doesn't mean it won't happen.
I think it's it's the same thing we were talking about earlier, where I think humans continually, as a species, collectively overestimate their importance. And I think it's easy to do that as you scale down into a book in science fiction. You overestimate the importance of the arc, to Ben's point, the idea that, you have this story, but the story glosses over stuff, right? You imbue the story with lots of meaning, but the meaning doesn't take into consideration all of these second and third order effects that almost by definition that will likely happen, but you can't predict what they are and you can't know what they are because the writer God didn't put them into the story, but then you start assuming they're not part of it, right? So you sort of put too much meaning in it and at the same time oversimplify. And I think the same problem exists in entrepreneurship. You put too much meaning into the thing you're doing. This thing we're doing is going to change the world. How many entrepreneurs say that? Right? That's the mantra of the entrepreneur. And how many things that people do actually change the world? A few, every now and then, and most of the time for not that long, right? So yeah, we're still using electricity. That was pretty important. The idea of putting too much meaning into the specific thing and then glossing over what happened along the way, right? Thomas Edison was a genius because he invented electricity is just not a factual statement, right? Because there's things wrong with it. Like, I don't know whether Thomas Edison was a genius or not. Let's argue that. And I'm not actually sure Thomas Edison invented electricity. Let's talk about that for a while, right? And so you put all those together, now string a bunch of that together in the context of an entrepreneurial story, and all of a sudden you're glossing over these second and third order effects. And I think that's the risk that's common between them. It's not the intersection point, but then I think, I'm inspired by William's book about AI, so therefore this must be the trajectory that this is on. And I believe that, and so now I'm going to go execute that. That sounds kind of crazy as an entrepreneur. You don't hear entrepreneurs saying that much, but I bet you in the next decade there will be more and more of those kinds of conversations as this curve continues and people start saying, well, what Kurzweil wrote, is it fiction? Is it philosophy? Is it science?
Well, that's the next panel, right?
Yeah, I think it's kind of all. And so if you take it as pure fact of a course that's going to happen, you as an entrepreneur will screw up.
We've got the wiser rule first. Student question lead in the back.
Yeah, so I'd like to play with the definition of science fiction a little bit. Some of you may call it fantasy, and I just kind of want to put this out there that I learned more from movies than books. A lot of really good movies out there, I'd say. But I think the perfect example would be Avatar. Some of you might explain that as fantasy because it incorporates more nature, I'd say. And Brad, I was asking you this question earlier. I mean, if you look at just the movie as it plays out, you have the human science fiction part, which is the robots, cyborgs, etc. Then you have this other type of somewhat science fiction, almost fantasy of the actual natives, right? And how they're able to tap in with systems around them, trees, and just really become instinct. And I just want to ask the question, where does that type of stuff, where does sacred geometry, spirituality, that type of stuff factor into science fiction or entrepreneurship?
So Avatar, I'll just answer. Avatar for me is unambiguously science fiction.
I agree.
I mean, it's like so much of the great science fiction I've read has creatures that we don't understand, that as humans we try to anthropomorphize, but because we don't understand them, we get a bunch of things wrong, and the collision between the two species is the tension. And the species often cross over, right? The arc of the story is that one member of each species start interacting somehow, sometimes in a romantic way, sometimes in a warlike way, sometimes in a learning from each other way, and that then changes the arc of both species, right? That's like my favorite kind of science fiction.
So have you read Reality Dysfunction by Peter Hamilton? So that series deals with conscious energies, and my book deals with controlling conscious energies. So I do think that more science fiction is starting to deal with spiritualism, and I think part of that is driven by, if you read a lot of quantum physics, you get the arc between, cosmology for sure, but you also get the arc over into philosophy and into spiritualism. And so I think we'll see more of it. I hope we see more of it.
I think it's awesome when dragons are in science fiction too, by the way.
Again, yeah, unambiguously science fiction, and actually a rather contemporary science fiction. I mean, it's about networks. That's what I understand.
Yeah.
The nature as network, right? They're plugging in their FireWire into ports, right, and interfacing with, yes, a kind of God, but it's a God it's the ghost in the machine. It's what happens at the end of Neuromancer when Neuromancer and Wintermute intersect, and suddenly you have the godlike AI that only can be intuited but not actually directly felt. So I think my problem with it is it's too science fiction-y, and it kind of reduces spiritualism to a really materialist substrate. Like, to me it says our computers are our gods in some respect, and I wonder if that's, not that I'm a spiritual person myself, but I wonder if that's a mistake to cling so tightly to that Enlightenment secularism that we don't believe in anything that we can't touch.
Right.
We start in the front and we'll go back.
So I'm just enjoying this day. Thank you very much, as dichotomous as it is. And my takeaway from today is how science fiction has informed so many successful entrepreneurs in their formative years with Dungeons and Dragons and watching Star Trek and just the Jetsons as cartoons.
I don't think people can hear you in the back if you're going to talk a little bit more.
So my
just hold the microphone closer.
my question is about the fact that science fiction informs your mind, your culture, your inspiration, your means of thinking about making an impact and changing your world in some way. And the new generation aren't really playing Dungeons and Dragons as much. That Star Trek isn't probably as consumed as much in the collective culture as it was years ago. So my question is, how do you foresee science fiction now adapting to be informing the new generations of future entrepreneurs? How are they playing Minecraft, or is it in apps? How is that very important component of science fiction informing the next generation?
Can I jump in with this?
Kids today.
Kids may not play Dungeons and Dragons, but there are more people who play World of Warcraft than there are people who make their living from farming in the United States. And yet, CNN will go out and say, we're going to talk to the salt of the earth, we're going to talk to a farmer. Nobody ever goes to New York City and says, so you're an elf, tell me what you think about the upcoming election. That World of Warcraft is a tiny nation within that straddles geographic boundaries. We may not play Dungeons and Dragons the way we used to. I certainly don't, but it's there. And I think, and your example of Star Trek, I mean, what Into Darkness was a big film last summer. It is tremendously consumed. Is it as good? I'll leave that. I don't know. I'm not a Trekkie. I have no dog in that fight. But what's coming out this summer? The Transformers, all these superhero films. I mean, this science fiction is huge business. It's not the Asimov science fiction or Heinlein, but it's a tremendously big. I don't know what it'll mean for, the kids now watching it and what kind of businesses they're going to produce. I mean, that's more a question for you guys, I think.
I have kids. I have kids that are 8 and 10, and they're reading science fiction. They're not reading the stuff I read, but they're still reading fantasy and science fiction. And I have twin 8-year-old boys that I come home, they're like, let's play D&D. So I don't think they've changed that much. But to back up what you said, I was trying to research this because I had heard it anecdotally, and all I was able to find was someone quoting Neil Gaiman, who had basically gone and talked with the Chinese government. I don't know if you had heard about this, and had talked with the Chinese government about their policy on science fiction, because it's been banned at various points and then brought back and then banned again. But apparently the Chinese government had at one time done a study of engineers in their country to find out why engineers were not as inventive. And so they surveyed engineers around the world, and what they found was that creativity was directly correlated with the amount of science fiction that people read. So.
And I think kids today have way more choice than we did growing up. You know, ours were more limited. I spent 5 years in the entertainment division at Microsoft with Xbox, and just the stuff that we are inventing now and the way our kids can consume multiple kinds of entertainment and how ideas come to life and are very real and immersive. I think it's part of that nonlinear curve.
I think the accessibility of it is dramatically higher today. When I was a teenager playing Dungeons and Dragons, there were a few of us. You know, when I got Ultima on my Apple II, there were a few of us that got obsessed with it, not, you know, an entire, you know, class of kids, not across a whole, you know, genre demographic. You know, it was even a decade ago. Video games were the, you know, the neckbeard nerd, you know, with his video game thing 15 years ago, I guess, first-person shooters. And now you think about the accessibility of video games, and you think about things like Rock Band and Guitar Hero and how that changed, just sort of boundary jumping in terms of genres. All of a sudden, music and video games merged, and all these people that were interested in music all of a sudden got interested in video games. I'll use Farmville as another example, right? There was at one point more Farmville crops on a more Farmville farms active and crops done on a daily basis than there are in cumulative annually in the world, right? And the demographic there was, you know, pretty broad but skewed towards middle-aged women, like a demographic that didn't play video games. So I think all this stuff is becoming much more accessible. It comes back to a risk, right? The risk is, in the entrepreneur vector, the wrong people working on the wrong things. So historically, many of these technologies and much of science fiction was driven by men. And there was a very sort of gender bias against a fair amount of it. And that gender bias is decreasing. And, you know, there's organizations like NC Wit here that spend a lot of time thinking about that and trying to understand it. But, you know, a game aimed at teenage girls, it's very hard to imagine that a 35-year-old white male is going to be effective at building that game. And so getting across all of those genres as science fiction becomes more accessible, it's not just the bastion of the male weirdo. I think that's an important part of it. That is a risk that we're still in because there is this big imbalance. And I think it's like the Chinese innovation curve, right? If you don't have your demographic working on stuff, you got a problem because you're going to end up with it being very, you know, unidimensional or missing a whole dimension that it needs to have.
On the gender imbalance, so traditionally published science fiction is very imbalanced, but I don't believe that's the case for indie published science fiction, right? It's really changed quite a lot.
It's very broad.
Nicole.
I'm Nicole Gravagna. Thanks for being here. This is really fun to listen to. My question is, so I'm an organization builder, and every organization that I've built, there's some element of uncovering philosophies or truths. And in doing that, you start to drink your own Kool-Aid, whether or not these truths are really true. And I'm wondering, as you're building these worlds that are fake, that are fiction, do you start to drink your own Kool-Aid and find yourself seeing the false truth in the real world?
Oh, I do that all the time as an investor. I continually create false realities for myself.
I'm not aware of doing it, but I don't know.
Oh yeah, I don't do them consciously. I just find out about them after the things come crumbling down on my head.
I don't think so. I find the opposite, whether it's in my own stuff or when I read other really great stuff, it puts you in this different world. And what I see happening is you start, maybe it's what you're talking about, but you start to see our world through that lens. And then it does change the way you think about what's happening around you. So it's drinking the Kool-Aid, but it's kind of doing it in maybe a different way than you're implying.
As a consumer of science fiction, I absolutely feel that way. I have, I finished one of Williams' books, and yes, that's how the world works. And then for the half-life of me remembering the book, which is, probably till I read the next book I read, where it's really front of mind, like all of a sudden, like, oh my gosh, that's a drone, and that drone is doing exactly what Williams said the drone does. And why is that drone controlled by UPS? And no, I know, but the point is that I think you carry that. I mean, as a consumer of science fiction, I carry that around with me. It certainly informs my worldview for some period of time, and how much of that fades into the background of my consciousness and continues to do its thing back there. The world is going to work this way because when I read that book, that's what happened, and I really resonated with it.
In business, I think we do it all the time, but that's our job. It's like our job is to convince you that our Kool-Aid is the Kool-Aid you want to drink. And so if we're doing our job well, then we're creating that reality for you. And if not, we have to change.
Sorry, I wanted to draw that back to Ben. You've expressed a couple times some dissatisfaction with science fiction overall, that you've used words like it smooths over what's going to happen to people after some technological leap. It smoothed things over. And I take her question to sort of ask something about that in terms of, does science fiction systematically not think hard enough about the consequences, that it believes in a certain philosophy, but it fails to bite the bullet of, if we really have this leap, and what is that going to do to the human condition?
So understand, like, it necessarily does, right? Because to go third, fourth, sixth, eighth, 37th order problems, right? You can't. I mean, those Peter Hamilton books are massive, and they don't get to all of them, right? They're enormous. So necessarily, to tell a story, you have to kind of ignore certain things. You can't tell the story. You can't tell the story of this room at this moment in any coherent fashion, right? There's too many people, too many thoughts, too many things going on. So, but understand that part of it is my kind of my disciplinary perspective on this. That literary critics, celebrate science fiction. It's especially the Marxists. It's funny that we're in here, capitalists, talking about science fiction when it is most often celebrated in my circles by people who are hardcore leftist anti-capitalists.
Why?
Because it's disruptive. They wouldn't use the term disruptive. They would scoff at that. But Philip K. Dick, for example, there's in Ubik, the character Joe Chip has to pay his door to leave in the morning. The door requires a quarter out of him, and it's just, look, our technology is now, it's embedded in this mode of production. You can't even leave your house without paying for something, and that anticipates all the free labor we're doing for Facebook by turning over our information, or the CAPTCHA that's used to authenticate words in Google Books or whatever. We're doing all this. Look at it. We're embedded in capitalism. We can't get out. And Philip K. Dick shows us that over and over again. But I still I agree with a lot of what they say. But I also think there's other things that other genres could teach us, such as horror fantasy, that that just get completely ignored because fantasy is impossible and horror is stupid or whatever. And so my dissatisfaction, I have no dissatisfaction with the writers. They're doing what the writers do. It's not their job to make it so. They tell what if stories, not just so stories. And I think the what if is really fascinating.
So I mean, if I understand what you're saying that there's not, that ideally there would be more exploration of those second order, third order, fourth order effects. But it feels like, to me, I mean, science fiction is doing the best job it can within what it is, right?
Completely agree with, yes, I completely agree with that. I teach, right? And my students are, well, what about, I'm teaching a book right now, A Hacker Manifesto by Mackenzie Wark, and all of his theory comes out of these other philosophies. And they say, well, what is this idea of the virtual? Well, that comes from Deleuze. And then I say, but that comes from Bergson. And then I say, stop, because you know what? If I tell you where it comes from Plato, it comes from, and eventually we can't talk about the book anymore because we're worried about all the influence. Eventually you have to kind of cut that off and just deal with what interests you right now, or what's the pressing question right now. And I think science fiction, of course there's bad science fiction, there's bad everything, but it does what it does. And I don't think that it's not about a value, is it good or bad, is it interesting or productive?
All right.
Okay.
Well, you get the last word.
Well, I was just going to say an interesting thing to me about science fiction is an inspiration is that when I wrote Avogadro Corp, I drew inspiration from Neuromancer and Hardwired and a few other books. None of them were really, strictly speaking, artificial intelligence stories. I mean, that was sort of was, but for Neuromancer. But only after I wrote Avogadro Corp, people came to me and they were like, well, have you read this book? Have you read this book? Have you read this book? And people were giving me the names of all these books that had been written that I wasn't aware of. That was about the emergence of AI. And it was a good thing I hadn't known about them. Because I would have said, oh, there's already so much written, I have nothing else to contribute to this field. So at the same time that the field inspired me, right, it was good to not know all the stuff that was in this one little micro genre. And I often think that has to be true for entrepreneurs as well. Like, it's good to be inspired by related businesses, but to know too much about the particular field you're going into, you would be overwhelmed by the failures and everything else that was in that market.
So we're going to take a 15-minute break. As I mentioned at the outset, in the hallway, there's going to be some things to play with and learn about. Please help me give a warm thank you to Ben, Christine, Will, and Greg. That was cool. Yeah, thank you.